Hey man, we're at the Moon Lake Campground, or the Moon Lake Lodge, at the little teeny amphitheater where there's some little bit of shade here, and I got Kent and Dave are going to be telling us some stories of what went on here with the Spaniards and here at the Moon Lake area. And so with that, Kent, start off for us and take it away.
All right, I'm going to start with a couple of quick little stories right here in the Moon Lake area, and then we'll move a little bit further west than that, but right here in the basin. Tell you a couple of better stories. These are pretty good in this area, but I've got some better ones. But anyway, so this was a real hot area. Moon Lake, by the way, as you came in, if you looked off that direction, off to the east there a little bit, you saw the dam. Well, Moon Lake was a natural lake, and then they wanted to hold more water, so they built a dam, and I'm not sure how many feet they increased, but quite a bit more water that it'll hold. And so from back in the olden days, it was a lot smaller reservoir because the dam wasn't there, and the natural lake wouldn't hold near as much as what it does now. But Moon Lake was sacred to the Indians, and they used to come up here and do sacred ceremony, one specifically that they had to do at night under the moon and that kind of thing. And the way I hear it, that's how Moon Lake got its name. It had to do with the sacred ceremonies of the Indians done at night. And I've been other places in the state of Utah where they do sacred ceremonies at night. They have rocks that are carved that they would put water in, and the ones that I'm aware of involved gold specifically. They would bring some gold nuggets out of their sacred mines, and they'd put water in I think 7 different areas on the rock, and gold nuggets and those kind of things. I'm not sure exactly what this ceremony was, but there's a lake not far from here that is on Indian ground that is also sacred, and they still do sacred ceremonies there. But this now is not controlled by the Indians, and they don't come here to do their sacred ceremonies anymore. But the lake itself has a lot of stories that go with it. There's a lake monster in this. The lake's quite deep, the natural lake, and then they've increased it quite a bit with the dam and that. And so there's all those kinds of things. But not far from here, off to the west, there's a mine that is still used by the Indians, a gold mine, that has 2 entrances. One of the entrances is typically left open, and one is buried every time they use that entrance. They go into the same mine. And a few of the stories that I've heard of that's fairly recent, maybe in the last 20 to 30 years, when the Indians come up to get gold out of the mine. Now, the Indians typically don't mine gold in the Uinta Basin and that. I don't know about other tribes and other places in the U.S., but in Utah, they don't. I don't know of any of them mining gold for profit as such. They're sacred, and people oftentimes wonder why they're sacred and all those kind of things. And most of the time, why people think they're sacred is not the correct reason they're sacred. Most of the reason, there's two main reasons that I know of for most of the gold mines being sacred to the Indians, not just the Utes and so forth, but a lot of the different Indian tribes. And the 2 that I'm really aware of, one is the Spanish came up, when the Spanish came over to the Americas and were in South America and Central and North Americas and that, they slaved to death in their mines about 50% of all Native Americans. It's like in the millions of people were slaved to death in the mines. And so one of the reasons the mines are sacred is because with Spanish involved mines, they worked the Indians so hard they would work like 16-hour shifts in the mines if you were a slave. And if you they had a pack made out of leather, and the band would go around your forehead. A lot of the shafts were vertical shafts, and you had what's called chicken ladders. They would take logs or whatever, and they'd put them down in, and they'd cut notches And by the time you were doing things with your hands, you just had to use your balance for the most part, and you could walk up these logs that are nearly vertical because of the notches. You'd use those like the rungs in the ladder or whatever, and you could walk up out of the mines. You'd have ore sack with a band around your head and hanging on your back pretty heavy. And if you were coming up and if you lost your balance or anything, and if you lost a load down the vertical shaft, typically the punishment was you had to work another shift. So you'd work 32 hours before you got a chance to rest. They literally would slave them to death, and so if you tried to run away and they caught you, they would cut your Achilles tendons, so from that point on you could hobble a little bit, and that was it. But you could never try to run away again. Anyway, they were extremely rough on the Native Americans throughout all the Americas and so forth, and so that was. So is what happened if you were in a major mine. There might be hundreds, potentially there could even be 1,000 burials associated with that mine, Indian burials of people that were worked to death in the mines. Therefore, they're sacred. There's sacred burial grounds associated with just about every mine that the Spanish worked. And whether they're a small mine and the ore pinched out real quick or whatever, if any of the Indians died there, they didn't haul them back to some tribal area or that. They buried them there at the mine site, and so there's sacred ground with pretty much every mine that has Indians there. And so anyway, we need to get into the better story. So not too far off to the west here of Moon Lake, there's this one mine in particular. I could tell you about several around here and stories of them, but this one of the last stories I know of, it would be the tribal shaman or that because they also use it in sacred ceremonies. That's another reason that it's sacred. And so one of the ways people say, well, how did the Spanish, how'd they in 300 years do so well coming and getting all these gold mines at? Well, first of all, they were really effective and real good at dowsing. And you can douse anything you want. A lot of people only know about dowsing water and so forth, but you can douse minerals, you can douse for lost people. If you lose your keys in the parking lot, if you know how to douse, you can douse for anything. And so the Spanish form of dowsing, which is real interesting, took two people, and they had little rods that came out with a kind of a U shape on the end, and you would lock them together facing each other, and you would douse for gold, and they were real good at it. But guess what? It's way easier than trying to douse and find your way with two people facing each other to gold mine. To when you came into an area, and if there were Indians in the area, and a lot of times they'd get in little skirmishes, the Indians didn't like them in their area and so forth, and so you might have a little skirmish with the Indians. And so if you killed one and you're up checking them out, a lot of them have a pouch hanging around their neck, and you check out, well, what's in the pouch? You open up the pouch, and it's full of sacred items that they receive when they go through manhood, the rites of manhood. It's a sacred ceremony. And so two of the things in those pouches of multiple tribes is 2 gold nuggets, and that's part of their sacred ceremony to make it to being a brave or making it into manhood or whatever. So if you were a Spaniard and you check out that pouch, maybe you killed one or whatever, check out the pouch, hey look, there's 2 gold nuggets in here, I wonder where they got those. Well, you go back to wherever their tribe is or whatever, and you capture Indians, you ask them where they got their gold nuggets. It's sacred, just, you know, maybe only the shaman knows where it's at, because typically it'd be the one that goes out and gets the gold for sacred ceremonies and that. And so you torture them until they take you and show you where their mines are, or until they die. But if they take you and show you, that's way easier than dousing the mine. Somebody that already knows where it's at, just torture them a bit, have them show you where it's at, and then you go back. And the Spaniards actually named a month of the year after when you go and capture your Indian slaves. It was a month that was named for capturing slaves. And at the end of the winter, we're going to tell you a little story about a real good place for arrowheads, and that real close. Or if you had a good enough arm, you could throw a rock and go get a bunch of arrowheads and that from Moon Lake here. But so the Indians would go out and get meat and that during the good times of the year, and they would dry a lot of the meat, and they would dry grasshoppers and grind them up into flour and stuff, things they could store for when winter time came. And of course they migrated a lot, went south quite a bit, but if they were in a cold area or whatever, food got real scarce, so you would dry meat and those kinds of things. But towards the end of winter time, you're starting to run low on your supplies before the game comes back into the area and that. And because of that, they're so weak that during this month is when the Spaniards would come in, and they're so weak they can barely get out of bed or anything because they're literally dying of hunger. And then you can round up entire tribes with just a few Spaniards, and then you feed them for 2 weeks or whatever, kind of get their strength back, and it's time to put them to work in the mines. You can also control them because you have weapons. You have blunderbusses, different kinds of things, and you have cannons, which really terrorized them. And they used to shoot the cannons off once in a while up in here, Boom Hill, down on Rock Creek and that. They had a big cannon. Whenever there was a lot of Indians around, they'd get up there and just shoot the cannon, and it would echo all over through that part of Rock Creek and that, just telling the Indians that, hey, don't get out of line because we can wipe you out pretty easy with our weaponry and so forth. Okay, so the mine up here, if it wasn't the shaman going to get the gold for the sacred ceremonies, you'd be under the direction of the shaman. But 2 Indians went up there, one of them quite a heavy duty guy, big fat guy, and so they were fighting over which entrance to go in, because one of the entrances is quite narrow, and for skinny guys, the other one the bigger guys can go through. And so they had to finally settle it out and go in the bigger entrance, which I think is the one they have to dig out, the skinny one, and that is one that they leave open. But they're on a little knoll or a hill not far from here, and one opens on the north side and one opens on the west side of the knoll, but they go into the same mine. But there's quite a few mines around here. I told you I'd tell you about the arrowheads. Not very far from here, it's a place, let's see, is Greg still here? Where's Greg at? Oh, there you are. It looked right at you. Okay, so you may already know the name. If not, you need to get your USGS map and that, but it's not far. It's called cow pasture. Do you know where that's at?
Right up here.
Yeah, not far. And so cow pasture, I was told by a guy that married my great aunt that was raised by the Indians, and he told me that his Indian friends, after he was grown and that, took him and showed him a lot of stuff, and so cow pasture was one of the areas where they did their winter meat. They would go up and kill elk at cow pasture, and the Indians called them, which is they probably got from white men, but in more modern times they called the Indians blacksmiths. And they would have their blacksmiths, they would have 3 of them that would sit all day long every day. There were 3 drainages, 3 little creeks come down in this, and they all met at the same point, basically in the middle of cow pasture there, and they would set up their business there, and they would all they do is make arrowheads all day long for the rest of the group, which is out hunting and killing elk. And so he told me that his Indian buddy and he were in there, and his Indian buddy took him up, and he took off his cowboy hat, and he says they filled it up with arrowheads in about an hour right there. So we hiked in one time. I don't know, that's been 30-40 years ago. We hiked in, and I don't know if you could ride an ATV in there now or not or whatever, but we, as I recall, we went up on the east side and then hiked down into it, and it wasn't a long ways and it wasn't really rugged or anything, but it took you a little bit of time to hike down in there. We got there and identified the drainages the way it was described to me and everything, found everything we needed to find to go arrowhead hunting, and the sun went down about then, and we had to turn around and hike back out, and I've never been back since. But I got too many things that and now I got this crow's boot on, so trying to get some surgery done, put me back in a shoes so that I can go hike into a bunch of stuff. But I always wanted to hike back in there because I was told that there's lots and lots and lots and lots of arrowheads in that area. So when you get some time, hike up there. I want to see your collection soon.
And where is that?
It's called cow pasture, and it's it's not far from here. It's real close, that way, north. So
on a map, it's Cow Park.
Cow Park. Yeah, the Indians call it cow pasture, but I was going to say that too, that as I recall looking at my maps, that it's called something just a little bit different than what the Indians called it. But anyway, because I want to tell you a couple of really good stories. I could tell you a lot of little bits and pieces here and there, but oh, probably should mention, I wish we had the real expert here, but he's in Germany right now and he won't be back for about a month. But the LDS Church had a map, and those of you that know something about Lost Rhodes Mine and those kind of things, Thomas Rhodes was a surveyor with Daniel Boone, and when they come out west and that, he was a wagon master. He was quite an accomplished prospector and that kind of thing. He had a lot of out in the wilderness type training and that kind of thing. And so Thomas Rhodes, as a surveyor, now I'm going to give you some Kent Smith scripture here. According to me, this is what I've taken from it. There's a copper map, and it's just the size of a sheet of type paper, but it's made out of a sheet of copper. And Thomas Rhodes, when Brigham Young was in here, Thomas Rhodes was involved in getting gold for the LDS, the Mormon Church, to both build the Salt Lake Temple. They also, right on the east side of the Salt Lake Temple there, they had a small cabin that was a mint, and they minted Mormon gold coins. Quite a few of them over a period of 14 years, 17 years, something. I can't remember exactly how long. If you happen to get hold of one, and I've got several of my own, but none of them are either authentic. The gold ones, I have a silver one, which is really unusual, but made out of silver. But if you happen to come across one of the gold ones while you're hiking out of here or whatever and find them, some of those go nearly $1 million now. If you can, but for sure, if you have one, I don't know if any of them sell for under 100,000 anymore. But they have different denominations, that kind of thing. But extremely valuable. Anyway, so they're getting gold for all this, and they talk about the Lost Rhodes Mine as one of the most famous in the state of Utah, and Phenomicon coming up. Terry and I are both going to speak at Phenomicon this year, and they kind of want us to talk about Lost Rhodes Mine because everybody's heard of that in Utah, and they all want to find it. And I think I've only heard of maybe 6 different Lost Rhodes Mine or Kerry Shanob or whatever. Everybody knows they've got the authentic, the real one, and that, but I've got 6 or 8 different ones, the stories, and a lot of them are written and everything. According to the Indians, what they've told me, there's no such thing as a Kerry Shanob mine. They're just sacred mines. Kerry Shanob, they tell me, was made up by the white man, but that name. But regardless, there's a lot of Spanish mines through the Uintas, and a lot of Spanish activity, and so. So anyway, but this map, this copper map, the church had it, and my speculation is that because it's very, very, very detailed on the copper map, is that it has Thomas Rhodes' name on it. It has a number of different people's names on it. It has a name of a guy who was the silversmith for the Mormon Church, and he made sacrament trays and things like that for the church. So my speculation is Thomas Rhodes came in and found, or the Indians showed him, where 3 mines were right here with Moon Lake. One of them is underwater now by the lake itself when they increased the depth in that. 2 of them still outside, and then real detailed. It shows trails. It shows a lot of different things on the map. It has 3 different languages. It has Reformed Egyptian on the map. It has Aztec writing, and it has Indian petroglyphs shown on the map. And my speculation is that Thomas Rhodes, being a surveyor, he drew this all up. Brigham Young wanted to have a map so that he had the information in case he died or whatever, and so they did a very detailed, he was a surveyor, map showing these 3 mines. And then my speculation is that Brigham Young was afraid that water or rats or fire or something would destroy this map that he'd drawn on paper, so he went to the silversmith, had him convert it from paper onto this sheet of copper. And that's how it got on the sheet of copper, because I seriously doubt that Thomas Rhodes put it on copper originally. Anyway, it was stolen from the church in 1917, I believe it was, and it's been missing since 1917. Well, Del Bascom, who is the current owner of the map, he did a ton of research on it and was able to track down a family that had the map. And sure, I don't care. So Thomas or Del Bascom obtained the map, purchased it from the family, and he's a member of the church. He was a bishop and a number of different things, but he went back to the church because it says that the owner is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints right on the map. So he went back to him and he said, I've obtained this map. It looks like the church is the owner. Do you want it back? I'll give it back to you, because the church owns it. And so they convened a group and they did some research and one thing or another, and they came back to Del and said, we don't have anything that shows proof that we own the map, and so you can keep it and do whatever you want. So Del has the map. He let me spend 2 days with it, photographing it. I shot thousands of photos of it, and my wife and my bishop blew it up, high definition. So I've got it great big now, framed in my house, and Del. I should have brought it up because I asked Del. He won't let. He told me I promised Del that I wouldn't let anybody take a photograph, or I wouldn't put copy of it digitally out on the internet or anything like that, but that I can show it to groups. And I should have brought to show you, because I do show quite a few people. Del's been a good friend. I knew Del's dad for a lot of years now. But anyway.
The first one was altered, so it was blurred out. The second one
That's Del's own book. He altered it so that you can only see portions that he wants you to see while he's talking about it in his book. The Schaefer one is not all blurred out in that, but it's small enough published in the book that you probably can't see all the details. You might be able to find Steve's published about 8 or 10 books. Steve was a close personal friend of mine. He's dead now, and you might be able to find it on, if you're interested in it, you might be able to find the book with it on, if you go to get online or something like that. But he's not around to sell his books anymore. But anyway, so that's the Moon Lake area here. I'm probably about running out of time. I'll tell you one more good story here before I turn the time over to our other speaker. So for those of you that are from the basin here, and I was raised out in Vernal and that, but if we go west from here a ways, several canyons, we get to White Rocks. And White Rocks, Rock Creek, which is real close to here, has lots and lots and lots of Spanish history and treasure and that kind of thing. And I've got a lot of really good stories there. But we're going to go even further. We're going to go to White Rocks, which also has a lot of Spanish history. And I'll tell you one good story there. So one of our good friends, back when our kids, which are all grown and have families, and I mean, this is a lot of years ago, when we had 5 kids, and I don't think all of them were quite born yet, but all our kids were real small, and we went camping up White Rocks with a couple of our good friends. And so Neil and myself got up early in the morning, and we went out and we're getting a campfire going and starting breakfast and seeing if the smell of breakfast would get everybody out of bed and one thing or another. And we were talking, and he's not into all the Spanish stuff, but I am. But I knew there was a lot of stuff in White Rocks Canyon itself, and that we got talking a little bit. And so Neil says, he says, I've got an uncle, and he says he told me a story about some Spanish stuff up here in White Rocks Canyon. And so I perk up, and I says, so what did he tell you? What did he tell you? And he tells me just a couple little things. He says, he tried to tell me a bunch of stuff, but I wasn't interested. It was all I can remember is just 1 or 2 little things. So I says, is he still alive? And he says, yeah, he lives in, is it Wellington that's up by Price? If you go through 9 Mile Canyon and you go past Wellington and then into Price, he says he lives up there. this quite a few years ago. His uncle's been dead for a long time now, but he says he's still alive. And so I says, okay, you need to go get with your uncle and get all these details. And so I wanted to make sure he asked him all the right questions. So we wrote it down on a piece of paper. I wrote a whole bunch of questions. So a few months go by, and he says, well, we had a family funeral. And he says, my uncle was there, and they had a family dinner afterwards, lunch afterwards. And he says, we went to, so he says, I purposely went and sat down with my uncle after lunch. And he says, and he had one of these little pocket recorders with the little tapes on it. And so Neil did. So he says, I went over and I sat down next to my uncle, and he says, I want you to tell me about this Spanish stuff up in White Rocks Canyon. And then Neil, so his uncle starts talking, all excited because he likes to tell people about it. So he started talking, and as soon as he starts talking, then Neil zones out because Neil's not interested in what he's saying, but he's got the pocket recorder going. So after the funeral, I call him and say, so Neil, did you get this? And he goes, well, yeah, I had a few hours worth of tape and that. And he says, I got home and I went to listen to it, and he says, the tape went for about 2.5 minutes and the battery went dead. And so he got 2.5 minutes of about a 3-hour conversation on the details on this, and the battery went dead. So I really got after Neil. So a little bit of time went by. They had another family funeral. Neil made sure he had good batteries and everything, and he went and he got this recording. So afterwards, got to listen to the recording. So the story goes like this: when he was real young, his dad leased grazing rights in the Uintas and over out of White Rocks there. And so they, in the summertime, when he was out of school, he would go up when he was 10, 11, 12 years old and stay up there all summer with his dad, herding cows and that and grazing them up around White Rocks. And so he knew the area real good. Well, his job was, there's a wild plant, I think it's called spurlock, I think is what it's called, and it's poisonous, but the cattle like it. And if they eat very much of it, it'll kill them. But if they find spurlock, they will, even if you herd them out of there, they'll try to graze their way back up into the spurlock, and they'll eat it and it'll kill them. And so as a young man, his job was get up in the morning, they'd fix breakfast, he'd eat breakfast, he'd saddle his horse, and he'd ride up into this meadow where there was this spurlock, and there'd be cows up in there grazing and eating spurlock, and he'd drive them all down out of the meadow down into the bottom of the canyon there. And they're not like sheep. Cattle will scatter out. Sheep will stay in a pack, but they'll scatter out. And so once he got up into the meadow and that, he'd start driving the cows down off the steep side of the hill, and he'd get off his horse at that point and hold it by the reins, and he'd yell and throw rocks to the right and to the left and keep the cows moving. Once he got them down in the bottom, he was done for the day, and he could go fishing, he could go riding his horse, he could go exploring, he could do whatever he wanted the rest of the day. Next morning would start the whole process over again. He'd ride up, the cows would be in there, and he'd drive them down out. So that's what he'd do every day. And so one day he's up there and he starts driving the cows down out of the meadow. It's mostly quaking ass now, and a hailstorm comes up. I can tell you, these things don't keep the hailstorm from hitting you very good if you're just in quaking ass. It's like you're just standing out in the open just about. And he was getting pelted pretty good, so he looks around and he spots a outcropping of rock with a little bit of an overhang over here a ways, and he thinks, I can probably roll under that overhang and get out of the storm. So he ties his horse to a tree, he runs over and he rolls under the rock, so he's looking out. And his eyes are kind of adjusting a little bit from rolling under it, a little bit dark. That he's looking out, and as he's looking out, there is a Spanish helmet out on the ground, and there's a human skull out on the ground. And so he comes from a real superstitious family, and he's like 11 years old or something, and that kind of scares him. That he ends up turning around and looking in, and there's enough. He doesn't have any matches, no flashlight, he hasn't got any kind of light, but he's looking into a mine or a cave. Not much of an opening in this overhang where he's laying, but he's staying out of the weather, and he looks in there, and with the sunshine that's shining in there, he can count 27 dead Spanish soldiers in there. They're laying in neat rows. their armor and their weapons and that are between each one of them. And he says, and then as it's getting so dark back in there that he can no longer see because it's too dark, he can see other weapons. He never, in the recording, he never got into the details on what that meant. I'm assuming because he talked about their individual weapons, which would be some kind of flintlock pistol, maybe a small blunderbuss, that kind of thing, that he's probably talking about cannons or some bigger weaponry as it goes back in and it's getting too dark to see anymore. It scares him real bad, but he lays in there until it quits storming. He gets out from where he's at, goes and gets his horse and rides down into the bottom of the canyon. He knew the area good enough because he went up there every day to chase the cattle out. He knew it really good. He gave a description of how far down from the meadow it was off the edge, how many yards. And he was real accurate at that. He was a gunsmith and different things, and he could judge distances really good, both professionally and as he hunted and all kinds of things and that. And so he tells about where this thing's at off the meadow and that. He didn't go back up that same year. The next year he went up there and he took the human skull and he took it down and put it on a tree stump down in the bottom, and he left it there for 3 years, and he finally took the human skull and gave it to a museum. He never took the helmet, and he never went back inside the cave ever. That scared him too bad, and so then from that point, I'd asked Neil, and we got enough communication back and forth between Neil and his uncle. I says, well, what does he think happened? And he says, well, he used to ride his horse up the White Rocks drainage up the river, and he says it used to bubble all the time. It doesn't anymore, but it used to come to all kinds of spots where bubbles would come up in the stream, and he says he figures there was enough volcanic activity or whatever underground, that kind of thing, and that was poisonous gas, and he figures they got back in there and they got gassed. And I thought about that for years. This story was, like I say, it was given to me 40 years ago or whatever, maybe longer than that ago, but anyway, that's what his uncle figured, was they got poisonous gas back in there and they all died. And he says that, and he thought maybe the Indians had killed them all, and the Indians did kill a bunch of them. But the Indians were famous with the mines. If they killed the Spanish at the mines, they had a number of rebellions that we know about. They would typically throw all the miners and everybody in the mine, and then they would cover the mine up, and they would remove all the tailings and everything, and they would make it so there was no trace there was ever a mine there. Because the idea is if anybody survived or anything, went back to Spain or that, they'd bring back more soldiers and that, they'd go right back to the good mines, reopen them, recapture Indians to slave in the mines, those kind of things. So they would try to hide those. If they can't find the mines, you can't mine it. You can't get slaves and you can't mine it. So they would hide them. So I says, well, it can't be Indians, because it described it as being neat rows of these dead bodies, and that they would have thrown them all back there in just a big loose pile and then buried the thing up if it was the Indians. So it wasn't them. I kind of doubt it was the poisonous gases, because if people started to react to poisonous gases and they saw people reacting, they'd get out of there. They'd realize something was wrong. And so I come up with a couple of my own theories, and my theories are, one of them was an early winter in the Uintas. Now, if you're up there mining, because they'd mine until the weather was going to get bad, and then you'd head south. You'd go back down to Mexico or South America or whatever. They'd put all your findings for the year on ships back to Spain, those kinds of things. And so my idea was, being raised out in the Vernal area, occasionally you get a real early winter or something. And so if it started snowing real hard and you were up in the Uintas, you'd know that you need to get your butt out of there real fast, or you're not going to get out of there. And so they probably would pack up immediately and say, we have to get out of here. And then if it's storming hard enough, they'd say, well, let's go back in the mine, or I know where there's a cave or something. We'll get out of the weather. And it'll be an Indian summer type thing. It'll storm a little bit, and then the weather will get better for a month or so before it really sets in serious for the winter. And so this is just a theory of mine, but I'm thinking, okay, so they went in maybe to get out of the weather. They'd send some guys out hunting for meat to keep them alive and that. And the animals, because of the snowstorm, are also moving out of the high timber and that, and they're moving down south, and they're moving down where it's warmer. And so if that early winter didn't ease up, all the game would start moving out of the area, and pretty soon you're not getting game. You're sending people out and that. They're probably laying down. If they're in there for a period of time, you lay down for survival. You don't move around a lot to burn up calories, all those kind of things. Probably have a bed, and you stay right in your bed for the most part. There's not a lot to do back in a cave or a mine anyway. And you got hunters going out, and eventually they died from starvation and from elements, exposure and that kind of thing. That's one of my theories. The other one would be maybe a disease, and if they got some kind of disease that went in there and wiped them out. And so if you go back into those kind of things and there's a potential for disease, some of those things can last for thousands of years, and that you got to be careful, because you don't want to be stirring up dust and things and poking around in skeletons and things and breathing in disease type things. But that's just a good one to whet everybody's appetite, because if you haven't been back in there, not only are they're probably cannons and guns and all kinds of skeletons and a lot of real interesting stuff, but he couldn't see just when it starts getting too dark back in there. He can't see anymore, but as it's getting too dark, he's still describing things till it gets too dark to see it. Gold, treasure, all those kind of things. Who knows what's in that cave with them. We've been up there a number of times, and we found Spanish carvings in the trees. We think we found the meadow that he's talking about. We did find also some diggings. It wasn't a mine shaft as such, but where they dug for a little bit and probably determined there wasn't enough whatever they were looking for to continue digging, that kind of thing. But we've gone up there a number of times, and like I say, we found evidence of Spanish and that kind of thing right in the area, and other things, but we haven't found the rock outcropping yet to be able to get us back in so that we can physically go in there and see what we have with that. So, and from his description, and he didn't know whether it was a mine or a cave. It sounded to me probably more like a cave, because most of the mines, they only took out, Spanish mines aren't like white man mines, so to speak, and that where we take out this great big tunnel and you put in carts and everything. They would take out just enough that they could squeeze little skinny starving to death bodies through, and that you would take out just the vein and just enough material that you could continue going back. It was a waste of time and energy to make it a big shaft. And so most of your Spanish mines are guys like me might not even be able to get back in there because we're too fat to get back in a lot of Spanish mines. But anyway, so I got lots and lots of stories like that all around the Moon Lake area and all up and down the Wasatch Front and that, all over the place. But I've got 2 boxes full of original maps that have been given to me to treasure and mines and those kinds of things. I've got 17 diaries full of information from people telling me stories where to go find the burial grounds and the mines and the treasures and that. And some of it's sad, because I've got all kinds of maps where there's lines all over a piece of paper, and I don't remember if he drew it or if I drew it. I don't know what the lines represent. Is this a canyon? Is this a drainage? Is this a road? Because when we were talking, we knew exactly what we're talking about, but 40, 50 years later, when I dig it out of a box, all it is a paper with a bunch of lines on it. And so good thing to remember. I could tell you all kinds of good hints if you're out in the looking for treasure and that, things you need to do from sad experience, what not to do. That's just, and I have quite a few of those, but I have a lot of them with all the canyons and everything else written on them and that. But if you get out there, make sure you document things well. And if you don't have a GPS or anything, I was one of the first people in line when they made it so that it wasn't just the military that had GPS. But I was one of the first ones in line to get GPS, because I went into place all the time that I could never find my way back. But I usually take a compass, try to get some readings off some mountain peaks. Now take a GPS with you. If you know names of canyons and roads and different things, make sure you get all that information on a map, because it's a sad experience, and I've talked to a lot of people that have had the same experience. You think you can remember all that stuff years down the road, it's a interesting trinket to hang on your wall, but they got the X's on them and everything. I could tell you some really good maps I have in that well, some of them that I still know exactly what everything means in that, but just really quick, I'll just tell you the very end of one. So I had a guy, our very first powwow that Mark and I did 23 years ago. A good friend of Mark had been trying to get us together for years, and I'm just going to tell you the very end. He, after telling us the story, and the story is a fantastic story, but I'm not going to tell it. It's too long. But at the very end, he says, well, I'm never going back. And I says, if you're never going back, would you mind showing me on a map where all this stuff is? And he says, not at all. Well, it's just like us sitting here if you said the same thing to me and you think, that's the end of it, I'll never see you again or whatever. He says, yeah, I wouldn't mind telling you. And I says, wait a minute. Of course, what he didn't know was my car parked outside Mark's house. I had my whole trunk full of USGS maps for about the whole state of Utah. So I run out to my car and I get the maps for the area we're talking about, and I came in and I rolled the map out in front of him. I says, okay, here's the map, show me where everything is. And so he goes over and he makes an X, and he says, right there's where you go in to get the treasure. And then he went over on a hillside and he puts an X where the hill goes up, and he says, right there's where there's wire gold that looks like chicken wire, but it's out of solid gold in the rock. And he says, you grab it and you shake it around and pull it out of the rock, and it'll look like a big chunk of chicken wire, but it's solid gold. And then he goes over on the hillside and he puts an X right there, and he says, right there's where the Indians are that are going to kill you when you go up there.
He wasn't kidding either.
And he wasn't kidding either. So yeah, those are the kind of maps and that I have, and stories and those kind of things. Most of the people that have been involved with the maps and stories I've got are dead now, unfortunately. Steve Schaefer, there's a lot of people like him that knew a lot of stuff. Steve and I went out on quite a bit of exploring, and we had quite a bit left that we were going to do when he died. But all the really knowledgeable people, most of them now, I still know just a very few that are still alive. There used to be quite a few more, but most of them are dead now. So died with their stories for the most part. So, and that's it.